Hello, my name's Jacob Wiley. I'm coming to you from Oregon State University. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there in person since there was some bad weather in San Francisco and I was completely stuck. Was unable to fly to Florida at all. So in lieu of a personal presentation, I'm going to be bringing you this video and I hope you enjoy it. I'll be presenting 3 case studies from one from Oregon, one from Colorado, and one from California. Before I get started, I'd like to thank John Peck and the other panelists for inviting me to present with them today. A little bit about my background. I'm receiving a JD from the University of Oregon School of Law, and I'm also a graduate student at Oregon State University, receiving an MS in Water Resources Policy and Management. So when John contacted me, he asked me if I knew of any completely voluntary groundwater organizations, and I couldn't really give him a straight example of one. And I also wondered to myself what exactly he meant by voluntary. Did he mean no state-mandated reductions, so curtailments in groundwater pumping? Did he mean that there wasn't any kind of outside pressure to conserve the groundwater? Is it a grassroots organization that starts with a group of, say, farmers or rural residents that want to conserve water? Is it local control, something like a city or a county that looks for a way to manage its groundwater? And can we develop some sort of voluntariness criteria so that we can compare these different organizations and see which ones are closer to the ideal voluntary organization and which ones kind of fall away from that? So to look at these different organizations, I developed these voluntariness criteria. The first one that I thought of was the type of control. Normally you'd think that a local organization would be more voluntary than a state agency. The other criteria is a trigger for action. Is it for altruistic reasons? Are they reducing pumping for fear of restrictions in the future, or are they legally forced to do so? The other criteria is the type of organization. A nonprofit or a water district, a county government, or is it a state agency? A completely voluntary organization may be something like a nonprofit. It doesn't actually have force legally, but has enough backing behind the community that they would do so. The least would be something like a state agency that just forces them to. And the other criteria is the goal. Is it for future generations' use, or is it development to expand current use, or is it to avoid litigation? Future generations would probably be more voluntary, and avoiding litigation, of course, would be the least. And what's the incentive mechanism? This is one that John particularly wanted me to address. Is it by force, or by money, or is there any incentive at all? The lack of any incentive would be the most voluntary, but many across the country are using money to reduce people's consumption. An example of this would be something like the CREP program that takes land out of irrigation and thus conserves water as a result. So the first case study I have for you today is from the Umatilla, Oregon. And Umatilla is near the top of Oregon. We're near the Columbia River. And it's a particularly dry part of Oregon. Normally people think of Oregon as quite wet, but on the other side of the Cascades, it's quite dry. The communities in the area are dependent on agriculture, and much of their water comes from alluvial and basalt aquifers in the region. The story of Umatilla's groundwater really began in the 1970s when irrigation really ballooned in the region. It resulted in 4 critical groundwater areas being declared in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the reason these were declared is decreasing water levels, and that resulted in mandated pumping restrictions. The reason this all happened was a 100 to 450 foot drop in water tables, so it's pretty dramatic. If you fast forward to more recent times, in 2003, because of the decrease in water availability and the state restrictions, the local planning commission proposed an overlay zone that would have banned all domestic well development, pretty much strangling all of the communities in the area to their current uses and maybe even reducing them in the future. The region was pretty much stuck. As a result of public outcry, the Umatilla County formed the Critical Groundwater Task Force, and they were tasked with looking for alternatives to the ban on development. And after a multi-year process in coordination with Oregon State University, they developed the 2050 plan with the goal of gradual recovery of the aquifer. As part of that plan, they recommended forming an organization to lead those efforts. That organization was known as the Umatilla Basin Water Commission. It was formed in 2009 under an intergovernmental agreement. It included tribes, irrigation districts, and county governments. And the goal of the organization was to manage a proposed aquifer storage and recovery project. They wanted to restore the groundwater levels, so the gradual recovery, and also reduce curtailments under the critical groundwater area. They also wanted to store, so the way they were going to do that was by storing surplus spring flows for later use in the summer. So to sort of level out that peaks and troughs that you get with precipitation in the west. In order to fund the project, local organizations lobbied for Oregon House Bill 3369. That gave money for the critical storage project. The stage one was $2.5 million to investigate whether the project would be viable. And then in stage two, $25 million would be used to construct the ASR system. 25% of the water saved would be required to be used for environmental benefits. Some of that would be used for salmon habitat or some other use. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful. The intention was for some of the water to be used in base flow in the Umatilla River, and instead it was draining to the Columbia River, which didn't provide the sort of habitat benefits that they were expecting. So if we use our voluntariness criteria to put Umatilla in context, it's a local organization. However, it's taking place within a critical groundwater area, so there's lots of state oversight. The trigger for action were the proposed growth limits and also the sheer drop in the aquifer. The type of organization was an intergovernmental commission, which is a bunch of organizations linked together. The goal was to expand growth in the area and recover the aquifer. The incentive mechanism isn't what you would normally expect. It wasn't trying to restrict groundwater use, it was actually trying to expand it and possibly return some of those waters that were curtailed by the state. So the incentive was future growth. So that's something that you could think about as under the ideal. It's looking in the future. It's not thinking about trying to prevent current uses. The next case study I have for you is the San Luis Valley in Colorado. The San Luis Valley is located in southern Colorado. It's near the headwaters of the Rio Grande River. The Rio Grande intersects multiple states. So it starts in Colorado, goes down through New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico itself. The San Luis Valley is at 8,000 feet, so it's way up there. So the San Luis Basin is divided into two major chunks. One is the closed basin, and you can kind of see that in the cross-hatched area, the darker portion. And the rest of it that's connected to the Rio Grande. And in Colorado, they call this tributary and non-tributary groundwater. And the story of groundwater there begins in the 1950s due to a drought. And that's really when groundwater pumping begins. But let's turn back the clock and look at the context of the San Luis Valley. In 1939, the Rio Grande Compact was signed, and that really dominates the region's surface water allocations. And groundwater pumping upstream tends to affect those surface waters. And in 1966, Texas and New Mexico sued for violations of the compact. And because of that, the state began curtailing groundwater. Even though this wasn't surface water and the Rio Grande Compact only discusses surface water, it was impacting surface water. So they began to restrict its use. So as part of that litigation, the Rio Grande Water Conservation District was formed in 1967 to represent the San Luis Valley and Colorado in the litigation. It's a self-directed administrative unit, and it's given the power to levy taxes and manage groundwater in the region. So if we fast forward to 2002, during a big drought, pumping increased in the San Luis Valley, and state regulation was more and more likely in order to meet the compact obligations. In response to those threatened restrictions to meet the compact, Senate Bill 04222 was proposed by a local farmer and politician. And what this law did is it prevents the state engineer from curtailing groundwater pumping as long as a management plan is in place. And in 2006, farmers petitioned to form the sub-district and create one of these management plans to prevent restrictions. This part of the organization was called Sub-District Number 1. And in its management plan, it was developed with local input and community meetings. And the goal was to reduce pumping to close to those in the 1970s. And they were going to do this through the CREP program and using water charges to provide partial funding. So what they did is they used the CREP program in order to take land out of production, and then used water charges from the land that is in production to further compensate farmers that wouldn't be farming anymore. And those were used using like 15-year contracts. And the goal was to have 40,000 acres fallowed in order to meet the expected groundwater reductions that they needed. So if we put the Rio Grande Water Conservation District in context, it's a really great example of a local organization. It's so local that a politician from the area proposed the bill that allowed it to exist. The trigger for action was looming state regulation. And the type of organization was a water district. The goal was to avoid that state regulation in order to meet the compact obligations for downstream users. And the incentive mechanism here is the standard monetary system. It's the CREP program with additional money coming from water charges. This is a really good example of a local organization if you compare it to our ideal, since it's local groups, local people forming an organization mostly by people from the area. However, the trigger for action, it's not altruism. It's mainly just to prevent future restrictions. The type of organization compared to what we have, it actually matches pretty well. A water district represents a local group, and it's pretty voluntary since most people have a vote. The goal was future uses or future generations. That's not here. It's avoiding regulation, pure and simple. So my last case study isn't really what you'd think of as a typical case study. It's more of a future case study. I'm looking at is the agencies that are going to be formed under the California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. So the reason this law was passed was because of drought and subsidence issues. If you look at the picture I have on the screen there, you can really see the drought was pretty awful. And the subsidence, it's one of my favorite pictures to the right of that. At the very top, there's 1925, and at the bottom where the man is standing is 1977. And those are the amount of subsidence that's occurred in California over time. What I was wondering is whether these organizations would be voluntary in the sense that they would actually be something like a local group coming together. Even though it's within the context of the state law, maybe these local organizations could be voluntary. So what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act does is it creates these SGAs, Sustainable Groundwater Agencies. Now those can be a county, or they can be a water district, or a completely new agency. It depends on what the county would like to do. They can be formed as cooperations between different organizations. For, say, you have an agency that does surface water and groundwater separately. One important aspect of these agencies is they're not basin-based. So what that means is that if there's a county line dividing a basin, it's going to follow the county line unless they can form an agreement with the other organization. And what these agencies are going to be able to do is require well registration, limit pumping, and they can also require reports from groundwater users and assess fees for water use. And these agencies are going to form sustainable groundwater plans. Now what these are a plan for groundwater management with a 50-year planning horizon. And part of those requirements is that they have to achieve sustainability within 20 years. Now, under the statute, sustainability means water use that can be maintained during the planning horizon without undesirable results. Well, so what does that mean? Undesirable results mean significant and unreasonable impacts. So one of the interesting parts of these SGAs is that they're going to have all of these different organizations all determining what significant and unreasonable means in their specific context. And they have a very strict timetable. By June 30th, they have to form the agency of June 30th of 2017. By January 31st of 2020, they have to have the sustainability plan adopted for critically overdrafted basins, and all the way out to 2040 with those other basins having to achieve sustainability. So if we put these California agencies in context of our voluntariness criteria, the type of control is a state-mandated local agency. So it's a little bit of both. They are voluntarily, involuntarily forming an organization and determining a sustainability plan for it. The trigger for action is simply a state requirement. They have to do it or the state will do it for them. The type of organization is many different kinds of local agencies. So there isn't really one specific kind. It's just going to be either groups of organizations linked by agreements or counties, depending on each location. The goal is to achieve sustainability. So they aren't really looking for expanding growth or future uses. They just need to keep what they've got in whatever way they can. The incentive mechanism is going to be a combination of all kinds of things. Since the plans themselves can be formed in different ways, it's really hard to tell exactly how they're going to achieve this. They might be using monetary compensation like the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. They might plan on future uses and look for future benefits, or they might have none, sort of like the Umatilla Basin, where really the only benefit is future use. It really depends on the local agency. So looking into the future, who knows? They could be voluntary and they might not be. Compared to our ideals, if we look at all the organizations put together now, the one with the best local aspects is the Rio Grande Conservation District. That local organization formed from local groups and local stakeholders and really probably matches the best for our ideal. For the trigger for action, really we don't have a good example of this altruistic beneficial future generations sort of motivation. Most of it's some sort of regulation or restriction coming down the pike. The type of organization, we don't have a single nonprofit organization. Most of the time we have some sort of agency. The Intergovernmental Commission in Umatilla is rather interesting, but we really don't have that sort of voluntary, non-binding sort of organization. The goal for future uses, really the Umatilla is probably the best example since they're trying to plan on recovering the aquifer, expanding what they have, looking for future generations' use. The incentive mechanism, we also don't have a completely voluntary one. Future benefits, again, Umatilla is sort of there. They're looking for future development, and they don't really use sort of that monetary restriction, economic sledgehammer. The worst case scenario is probably the Rio Grande, where they really are just trying to price people into doing the right thing. And if everyone's interested in doing future research on these organizations, Martha Pagel's paper is extremely good for the Umatilla Basin. There's hard to find information about that. Also, looking specifically at the 2050 plan itself provides a whole lot of information. Tina Lay's paper gives a really good overview of the development of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I would recommend reading it. And Kelsey Cody's paper is also very good on the San Luis Valley. Again, this is a rather difficult one to research. Looking at the actual management plan is another really good source. I'd like to thank John again for inviting me to come to the presentation, even if I wasn't able to make it. I'd also like to thank the other panelists here today, and I hope that this video is interesting for the folks that came to the presentation. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. John can give you my contact information. And I'll hand it off to the next presenter. Thank you.